Hello there, Krissa here. Welcome into another video. In this video, I am going to talk about this piece and my process behind this piece. So let's just launch right into it. First, I start out with my signature extremely rough sketching with the transparent watercolor brush. And my sketch stays pretty rough when I move on to the next stage, which is kind of line art, kind of sketching. So parts of it are fairly clean line art, but then there's other parts that I'm definitely still figuring out. So I use the line art to kind of figure out what's going on with her flowing hair and then also her body and arms, because those weren't totally figured out. And if you're wondering where the far arm came from, it's I drew it on a different canvas. That's something often that I do, and so you might be curious about why sometimes things just kind of pop into life in these time-lapse videos. It's because I will often have a second canvas window open while I'm working on a piece to really hone in and focus on drawing things that I find challenging, so things like the arms, without getting distracted by the rest of the piece. So often I will do this with arms and hands, and you will see this a little bit later with the skulls as well. Here I kind of drew in the scythe and just kind of winged it as I drew it in, and it came out to be a little bit high on the canvas, so I will be lowering everything else down. But right now what I'm doing is I was kind of figuring out her costume and the folds of her costume and her dress, and giving her some nice puffy sleeves and puffy skirts, as well as a flowing sort of obi belt that goes around her waist. And I really liked how the arms and the hands turned out, so I really wanted to darken the line art around the edges of those. This is the stage of line art where I am really just trying to refine the last little details before I move on to colors. So I'm adding little folds, darkening in certain areas that I feel like need a little bit more line weight, and cleaning areas up. But now I'm placing the skulls with just little guides as if I were drawing little heads, because I guess that's what it is, right? It's a little head. So I drew the little guide for the skulls that I'm eventually going to be placing in her hair. So just very roughly defining the skulls so they don't just look like random heads, and then moving everything down. And you'll see here how the skulls kind of popped into existence here. The skulls I drew again on a separate canvas where I focused completely on the skulls and not the rest of the piece or the hair or anything getting in the way. So that's where those came from. But now what I do is I am putting in the flat colors. So I changed the background color to kind of the color scheme that I'm thinking of, dropped in the entire color for her silhouette, and I'm now filling in the flat colors before moving on to doing a rough wash for the background. And now I want this piece to be quite textured and watercolor looking. So now I paint in some rough gradients. Often when I paint gradients, I will use a soft airbrush, but because I want this piece to be very textured, I use actually that same rough watercolor brush that I used in the background. And it's not that I'm completely shading the piece on one layer, it's just kind of adding an indication of some color variation and shading before I move on to actual shading. And speaking of actual shading, that's what's going on right here, is I'm starting to add in some actual shading, and this is on a new layer. That is a hard light layer mode, and I am using a watercolor brush that has a very hard and textured edge. It's even more textured than my usual Walter wet brush, and I think I got this brush that I'm using, I want to say from the Clip Studio Paint asset store, but I will have to double check, and I will find it and include either a link to where you can get it or information to where you can get it, because it's probably by another artist, so I want to give credit where credit's due. But I will include that in the post for you guys, because that's basically the brush that I use for all of this really tasty watercolor texture. It might be Sims Art's brush, but I will have to double check. That's what I use for the shadows, and then adding in, just now refining the shadows using the eraser to kind of adjust them a little bit. You'll notice that I also started to add in a little bit of the red ribbon and stuff, and I just used the G pen for that to kind of get the silhouettes of it. I noticed that after I kind of had the colors filled in, the strong red in her scarf was just so bold and strong that it needed to be balanced out a little bit with some red the screen left side of the painting and just kind of varied throughout the painting so that it wasn't focusing only on that strong red scarf. Then at this point, I tried to add a little bit of rim light because I wanted the edge of her face to stand out a bit, but I didn't think it was working very well, so I ended up removing it. And here I'm adding in hatching to her skirt to give it that nice hatched texture. I'm such a fan of hatching these days that, yeah, I just have been adding it to everything. And then again with these little red pieces in her hair, adding in these little red like tie decoration type things so that the red is scattered a little bit more throughout the piece. And adding a texture over top of everything so it has a more papery texture to the piece, a more papery quality, as if this is really painted with watercolor. You'll notice that I added in some of the dark smoke or mist into the background to kind of help balance out the darkness of her hair. So adding in these designs, these swirling smoke designs, so that it kind of just balances that out in the edges and the corners of the canvas. And now I'm using a glow layer to add in some shine to the metal of the scythe, which I turned off for now, but it's still there. And then very roughly painting in some indications of vertical trees in the background. Nothing too detailed here, you notice they're very, very rough indications. And I wanted to pop her face just a little bit more, and so I thought it might be interesting to try and add some sort of face paint or markings that's white, as if it's kind of indicating a bone or a skull, but in a very subtle way. I don't know if it really came across, but I do like the look of it. And then I added some dark blue to kind of darken the top of her face, because I always feel like that makes a piece a little bit more ominous. It makes a person a little bit more ominous when you add that a little bit of darkening, as if they're kind of shadowed over the eyes almost. And then adding in some design, some swirly design to her shirt, and just kind of generally going through and refining little details and adding particles. And that's basically it. So I hope you like this piece, and thank you guys for watching, and thanks for all your support. Happy drawing!